for that little intermission. But back to what I was saying. So there's 4 different types of functions for or purposes for behavior. So we have escape, we have access to attention, like I was talking about my son who's throwing temper tantrums, so I'll pick him up. Access to tangibles. My example was the kid who bites his sister so that she'll drop her donut, he can get it. And then sensory. And I was saying that a lot of times our kids are labeled with sensory behaviors, and a lot of times they have sensory behaviors. But I think sometimes they also they're displaying the same behavior for multiple functions, and it isn't always sensory. So that's one thing that we can advocate for, is making sure that it is sensory. And the only way to determine if a behavior is serving a sensory function is if the behavior is occurring with no consequence. So if the behavior is occurring when the child is alone and it doesn't appear to be getting anything out of it other than the behavior itself, then it is sensory. So you always have to make sure that it is a sensory behavior, and when you do that, the behavior must be occurring when the student is alone. So the most important thing to remember is that behaviors have multiple functions. They can have multiple functions. And this is very important for us to know as TVIs, because oftentimes a behavior that occurs within a classroom with the teacher, the classroom teacher, can look the same, like the same behavior, but with us, when we pull them out to provide services, most often we're itinerants, we provide pull-out services, the child can be exhibiting the exact same behavior, the same topography it's called. It looks like the same behavior, but it serves a completely different purpose. So here I have 3 different pictures, or I'm sorry, they're the same picture that I've repeated 3 times. And here we have the kid on the left, and he's biting his sister so that she'll drop that donut, and he wants that donut, so he's gonna bite her. So that first picture is a access to tangibles behavior. And then the next picture, he's gonna bite her so that mom will come running. Mom's been very busy, and he wants her attention, so he's gonna bite his sister because he knows that she'll scream. That's an access to attention function. And then let's say the last picture is that let's say he bites her so that he can get out of doing work, right? So he bites her, and every time she every time she asks him to do something like put away his toys, or maybe he wants to play with the toy, and he doesn't want her to bother him. He'll bite her so that she'll go away. So that's an escape function. So even though the behavior looks the same in every single picture, he's doing it for different reasons. So the behavior is serving different purposes. So always remember that the behavior can serve more than one function. So to review, these are very common principles and vocabulary that is important to know when we're working with behavior and we're trying to collaborate with the behavior specialist. We're looking for the antecedent, and that's the trigger. What happened directly before the behavior happened? We're also going to look at the function, and what is the function? Was it escape, sensory, access to tangibles, or attention? And the only way we can determine function is really by determining, by collecting all that data. And what's the reinforcer? So it's really important that when we're doing an assessment and we're looking at behavior and we're collecting our data, we determine the function. We also have to ask ourselves, what or who is reinforcing the behavior? We have to be open to the fact that a lot of times it really might be us, right? Like the example of the student who throws that temper tantrum every time a worksheet is put in front of them. We're actually reinforcing, or the teacher's reinforcing that behavior when she takes away the page. So we have to be open to the fact that most often it's usually us that's reinforcing the behavior. All right, so I'm sorry that that was so quick, because really you could put all that information into a semester or more, right? If you have any information, if you have any questions, please ask them. I'm putting a discussion up, and that's really just for questions. If you have any questions for me, or if you looking for additional resources, and I'm going to put up different additional resources as well, because the IRIS Center has great resources for both data collection and assessment. So what do we really need to know when we're collecting data as the TVI? So we need to know an operational definition. So like I kind of said in the beginning when I talked about what is behavior, behavior has to be observable, measurable, and repeatable. So it can't be, that kid really lacks motivation, right? Because we can't, that's not something that we can observe. We can't observe the fact the kid has no motivation, that we can't measure that. That's just our opinion, right? We can, like the example of the boy that's crying, we can measure that multiple ways. We can observe it. We can measure the duration of the crying fit. We can see how often it occurs, when during the day it occurs, and we can certainly look to see what are those antecedents, those triggers that might be triggering the behavior. And then we definitely want to see the consequence. What is the child getting out of from their behavior? What's the purpose or function? So we need to make sure that we're defining behavior in a way that is observable, measurable, and repeatable. All right, so why do we want to change behavior? We want to make sure that all of our behavior that we want to change is socially significant to the student. And so that's really important when we look at things. And I think most behaviors that we look at within a school is going to be for the benefit of the student. We always have to make sure that we're trying to make a change for the benefit of the student. So when we look at behavior change, we need to ask ourselves, what's the behavior? We need to define it operationally. We need to ask ourselves, why are we changing it? Is this change important to the student? And we also need to determine through assessment, what's that function? What are those functions? All right, so let's look at this case study real quick. I have a picture of a very cute girl. She's got bright pink pants on, and she's got that cane out in front. She's looking proud of her cane. And the case study I'm about to explain to you is a student that I had who has septo-optic dysplasia, and I was his orientation and mobility specialist. Individuals with septo-optic dysplasia can oftentimes exhibit autistic-like behaviors. And so the behavior that he had that was of particular interest, that was identified for change, was drumming. And we defined drumming as any amount of repeated slapping of his self or objects at the table. And so he would drum. He would drum his chest, or he would drum the table. Sorry, I moved the screen. Or he would, if given a drum, he would drum that. If he didn't have anything to drum, he would drum his hand. So he would use one hand to slap the other hand. And it would get to the point where, his left hand would get so bright red, and it would look like an overripe tomato, and it was just going to crack. So it was very visually disturbing to the service providers and teachers around him. So is that socially significant? Do we need to change it? Yes, absolutely, because the behavior was causing damage to himself, and it was interfering with instructional time. So absolutely, it was socially significant. So now we had to assess. We needed to determine that function. So behavior data was collected in his classroom. The district specialist came out and observed him multiple times within his classroom. And I think with a few service providers, and that she collected that ABC data. What's ABC? So she was looking for the antecedent. She was looking for the drumming. She was looking to see if the drumming, when it occurred throughout the day, how long it occurred. And really, when she determined the drumming, she discovered it was probably sensory. Because he would sit in the corner often during his downtime, and he would rock and he would drum. Rock and drum, rock and drum, rock and drum. And so that behavior was determined as sensory. And so how we were told to address it was that he would be provided with a drum, this kind of little plastic drum you buy at Walmart or whatever. And so that he wouldn't slap his hand, he would drum instead. He would be able to continue with that sensory need, but in a safe manner where he wasn't hurting himself. And I thought, well, that's great. It's really the first important thing to do when you're collecting data is indirect data, right? So you're going to be interviewing the parents and all the service providers. And I've got all in capital letters because that means you too. And even though it's the behavior specialist's job to collect all that indirect data, you have to advocate for yourself and your student and make sure that you are also interviewed. Nobody asked me anything. And I really should have said, hey there, ask me what I think, right? I should have been interviewed as one of the service providers and no indirect data was collected. And no one came and observed me during my instruction with him. I pulled him out so that we could work on routes, getting to the cafeteria and to the bathroom independently. And nobody ever came and observed me during that time. And even though I was providing a different environment and me as a different teacher or creating different environmental situations, no one came and observed me. But the behavior intervention plan I was expected to follow. I think that happens a lot. I've had numerous students on behavior intervention plans, and I can honestly say I've never had a behavior analyst come and say, I'd like to observe you during your service time. So it's really important that we advocate for ourselves. So that ABC data collection and scatter plot, just because I was a student in the behavior class is the reason that I was collecting my own data, because I was interested in this drumming. One thing I noticed that he was doing was that he was drumming anytime I asked him, let's go back to class. So we were perfectly fine walking around the school, very happy to do that. And then as soon as I said, okay, we need to go back to school, or we need to go back to class, right away he slapped his hand. And then it would disturb me because his hand would get so red, it would make me nervous. And I'd say, okay, let's walk a little bit more, and immediately would stop. And I thought to myself, okay, I know enough about behavior to say, this is not a sensory function. He has discovered that he can escape from situations that he doesn't want to be in, or escape from expectations like going back to your classroom when he starts the drumming. And so the drumming, while sensory in some environments and in some situations, served a sensory function. With me, and anytime I asked him to go back to class, it was really an escape function. And so I had to tell the service provider or the behavior service specialist that I thought that the behavior was serving two functions, and it was different for me, and I needed her to come out and probably do the assessment that she should have done to begin with. And so, like what I said before, is that behavior served two functions, sensory and escape, and the intervention plan needed to address both those functions, because me handing him a drum was not going to stop the drumming, because he was doing it specifically to his hands so that I would get nervous and say, let's keep walking. So here are behavior takeaways. All behavior is purposeful and has a function, right? Kids don't do things just to do them. No one does things just to do them. All behavior is in response to environmental triggers or antecedents. What was the trigger?